Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really honored to have such a crowd and to be back in this wonderful room and at this school, and this room in particular where I attended many Dean's Teas when I was a student in both the MTS and the THD program, and never double dipped my tortilla chip in the salsa, I would like to say. But anyway, it's been great to be back, and I just wanted to thank many people, of course, Ann Browdy, and all the scholars involved in supporting the Women's Studies and Religion program for this wonderful opportunity, and my fellow scholars and this year in the program with me. You've been a wonderful cohort and group to work with. And then a special thanks to my mentors and friends who are here, who were my teachers when I was here at the Divinity School. It's really a pleasure and an honor to see you and to have you here. And then I do have to thank my research assistant at Carleton College who helped me with this project last summer through our Humanities Center, and her name is Brick Gronowski, and then also Laura Sanchez here at Harvard. So the title of my talk is Sexuality and Secularization, Mariana Weber and the Origins of Religious Studies. So during the years around 1900 in Heidelberg, Max and Mariana Weber participated in a salon and later hosted one of their own that included rising stars and established scholars who were involved in shaping the contours of their academic disciplines and debating the significance of modernity for long-standing intellectual categories and institutions in the realms of politics, religion, culture, history, economics, and society. Numerous scholars, such as Adolf Deisman, Karl Röttgen, Eberhard Gothein in economics, Ernst Troeltsch in religion, Wilhelm Windelband in philosophy, philologists, scholars of constitutional law such as Georg Jelinek, reflected on political modernization, the rapid growth of modern capitalism, the rationalization of Western culture, and social reform. As Friedrich Wilhelm Graf has shown, these scholarly endeavors entailed and were predicated on a decisive call for new interdisciplinary research. And this interdisciplinary call was animated by an understanding that the complexity of the modern world required the resources of many fields. And for theologians in particular who participated in these efforts, this was a somewhat controversial move, a shift from certain definitions of church history to a doctrine more about the study of religion as a historical and cultural science. Academic fields in their modern instantiation were being created or reshaped in relation to the intellectual, political, and social developments of the period. This was particularly true of sociology, which was emerging as an independent field and whose nomenclature, Soziallehren or Soziologie, was being taken up by other academic disciplines to signal this interest in an interdisciplinary analysis and thematization of the origins, challenges, and future of the modern world. And one thinks, or I should say, I think of Ernst Troeltsch's book, The Social Teachings of the Christian Churches and Groups, or Die Soziallehren der christlichen Kirchen und Gruppen, to show how this approach to the study of church history really did draw on this new understanding of sociology as a tool and other disciplines as a tool for animating the history of different Christian doctrines over time in a new way. So exploring the cultural significance of various historical phenomena was part of a larger effort to ask what the humanistic and cultural sciences could contribute to help avert the so-called crisis of modern culture. A crisis which, as Ann Taylor Allen has insightfully suggested, has become a bit of a cliche in accounts of the mood among intellectuals of the period. Because for many women intellectuals, she suggests these challenges and changes evoked a sense of optimism and not the alleged sense of cultural alienation or pessimism that we see in a lot of the male philosophers of the period. In other words, the contingency revealed in the scholarship of the modern world opened up new possibilities for women intellectuals in terms of interpretation of sources and new imaginings of social relations. It was for this circle that I mentioned, this salon, the Eranos-Kreis, or the Friendship Circle, that Max Weber first wrote and delivered in 1904 his essays that would become The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Describing the days leading up to Max's presentation, which was to take place in the Weber's home, Mariana wrote in a letter, probably to her mother-in-law, "Tomorrow, Sunday, the Eranos, the scholarly discussion group with 10 gentlemen, is in store for us. Max is taking care of Protestant asceticism. I am in charge of ham in Burgundy." These circles were a new kind of academic interaction and exchange among intellectuals, private gatherings where men and eventually women, in the words of Gunther Roth, would share intellectual and artistic interests outside the status hierarchy of the old professoriate. The scholars in this Eranos circle took particular interest in the role of religion as a source of ethical orientation in the face of a perceived crisis of modern culture. Within this group, Ernst Troeltsch developed in a paper that he initially delivered somewhere else in 1906, his influential interpretation of the Reformation as a continuation of the medieval period, and therefore repudiated the idea that Luther was the founder of the modern world. Instead, Troeltsch looked to Calvinist-derived sects and other forms of ascetic Protestantism for the seeds of so-called modern impulses within Christianity. Also in the Salon, legal scholar Georg Jelinek would develop a theory about the origin of the modern idea of freedom of conscience and individual rights, looking also to the Puritans and the Quakers as innovators in this area. For these thinkers, religion was a force capable of shaping culture. And the question was in what ways Christian religiosity and modern so-called religion in general might contribute positively to the values of the modern world. As Mariana Weber's comment indicates about Ham and Burgundy, women were excluded from the Salon, and indeed they were from much of university life at the time. They were, however, in no way absent, or at least not wholly absent. Mariana was, of course, physically present, though presumably overseeing the kitchen staff as hostess, but was also involved as supporter of Max's career and promoter of his ideas, and as a well-known scholar in her own right, who engaged in intellectual exchange with some of the leading intellectuals in this and other circles. During this time, Mariana Weber's research on religious and legal norms concerning women and the family made an important contribution to these discussions. She not only drew upon and helped shape abstract categories about domination, authority, and the nature of religion itself, but also used her research to call for the reform of Germany's marriage laws and to weigh in on cultural questions about sexual morality and the rights of women and children. Indeed, the question of women's emancipation was in the air and was therefore among the features of modern culture that these scholars grappled with, along with other themes related to social reform and labor. Finally, so-called woman as an abstract category and other related categories like family, eroticism, and marriage were present as conceptual tools in the analysis of the ethos of modern culture, which was often perceived by these male scholars, such as Georg Simmel, for example, as undergoing a crisis or engulfed in a tragic situation shaped by the alienating influence of bureaucracy and rationalization on human interactions, and by the loss of genuine subjective, read female, versus objective, read male, community. These academic circles then were located in a cultural context marked by experimentation, cultural innovation, ideological clashes, and new calls for emancipation, such as that made by the women's movement. New ideas about sexuality, aesthetics, and culture clashed with defenses of old institutions and values. The conversations in many of these new intellectual circles engaged questions of art, religion, and politics. During this time, for example, the so-called new ethic, advanced by members of an avant-garde in favor of sexual liberation outside of the confines of marriage and a celebration of eroticism, was a controversial topic of discussion in Heidelberg's intellectual circles. More broadly, the years around 1900 saw the creation of large women's coalitions in Germany. In 1908, legislation was passed that officially allowed women to congregate and participate in political meetings. During these years, Mariana Weber and other leaders of the women's movement in Heidelberg, including spouses of faculty in the Eranos-Kreis, organized lectures that started a women's legal council, organized lectures for women and started a women's legal council that addressed issues such as abortion. As Klaus Lichtblau has written, German sociology, quote, which understood itself mostly as a Kulturwissenschaft or a cultural science, and the bourgeois women's movement mutually influenced each other. In fact, there were close contacts between male sociologists and the leading figures in the women's movement, end of quote. There was then a reciprocal influence between the bourgeois women's movement and the nascent discipline of sociology and other cultural sciences. Thus, it ought not be surprising, but still has received insufficient attention, that the theories of cultural modernity crafted by many of these intellectuals included both a direct treatment of gender issues and, more indirectly, tended to represent the cultural crisis of the age as a gender problem, or in gendered terms. For many scholars, the polarity of male or female often stood for other fundamental dichotomies that were used to talk about the modern world: history and prehistory, culture and nature, order and disorder, community and society. So while some acknowledgement of this history is recognized in accounts of the origin of sociology as a discipline, analyses of the origins of theories of religion and modernity largely ignored the debates over women's rights and definitions of gender, sexuality, and the family that were central to the period during which the modern discipline of religion was created. In my current project, which is very much a work in progress and still in its beginning phases, I use the work of Mariana Weber to explore the gendered dimensions of theories related to religion, social order, and secularization in fin de siècle Germany. Today, I shall discuss 3 important ways that Mariana Weber employs and shapes nascent intellectual categories in her major work on the history of religious and legal codes concerning women and marriage and the family. First, I focus on her treatment of so-called primitive religions and cultures, showing how she draws on tools of anthropology and social theory to differentiate types of marriage and authority, and to craft a typology of religions that is deeply shaped by normative questions about sexuality and gender relations in our own time. Second, I look at broad features of Weber's analysis of marriage codes in monotheistic religions and demonstrate the crucial role they play, in her view, in both promoting and hampering women's rights. Finally, I look briefly at how she weaves this typology of religions and their systems of sexual ethics into a narrative of modernization that points to Puritan models of marriage as providing important features of a more emancipatory view of gender relations, and that therefore resembles some of the studies of Puritans in questions of modern individualism that were created, of course, by her husband Max, but also by thinkers I mentioned, such as Georg Jelinek and Ernst Troeltsch. Looking at these and other aspects of Mariana Weber's work, I suggest, helps us see that questions of gender informed the construction and application of theoretical tools and distinctions that would shape the study of religion into the next century. That is to say, her work points to some of the normative dimensions and meanings of categories like religion and modernity, and helps reveal the values and cultural debates that were at stake in the definition of these terms. So before engaging in this analysis of her work, however, I first have to answer the question that Anne Braudy posed, which is, who was Mariana Weber? And here I am very much reliant on an important essay by Günter Roth, and also by recent reviews of and some of the material from a new biography of Mariana Weber by Barbara Moyer. So if things were different, we might view this question, who was Mariana Weber, as an odd or humorous question, because it seems fairly well established that Mariana Weber was more famous in her own day than Max Weber was. So there are stories that are well known and accounted for in the various biographies, including some excerpts from her own, where someone would ask, who's Max Weber anyway? Oh, that's Mariana's husband or Mariana's guy, and similar stories. Yet today the situation is surely reversed. We can learn a lot about Mariana from her biography of Max, published in 1926, and she also wrote two memoirs, the most famous being her Lebenserinnerung, but she still is somewhat enigmatic as a historical figure due to various interpretations and levels of availability of her letters and details about her life and work and the archival material that is available concerning the women's movement and her role in it. It's difficult material to navigate. So Günter Roth's detailed portrait of her and her circle, which stands as the preface to the English translation of her biography of Max, offers an invaluable account of her life, and more important, her context in relation to the women's movement and cultural context in which she wrote her fascinating Weber family history. Barbara Moyer's new biography, notwithstanding its somewhat controversial status due to its both positive and critical reception among Weber scholars, gives much more detail, especially concerning her role in the women's movement, as does a volume of essays she edited by a number of scholars who contributed articles on her thought and on the context of Heidelberg and her relationship to Max Weber's publication, for example. But beyond this, there is very little published about her, and her works have all but fallen into obscurity and have never been translated into English, except a few excerpts here and there. So Mariana Weber was born in 1870 to Anna Weber and Edward Schnitger, She was the granddaughter of Max's uncle, Carl David Weber. So she and Max were cousins once removed. Mariana's mother died, Anna Weber, at the age of 22 while giving birth to Mariana's sister. Her father was a physician and suffered from mental illness. She was raised by both an aunt and then eventually by a grandmother, several of whose other children in the household also suffered from serious mental illness. Among those children who were healthy were mostly girls and ended up being teachers and helped raise Mariana, who describes herself in the third person in her biography of Max as having a joy for life and being capable of, quote, assimilating all these impressions of hidden horrors and terrible sounds of mental illness without suffering any perceptible harm. Only when her childhood was over did her past experiences return to weigh upon her. Now she rapidly grew to be a meditative, questing personality, receptive to joy and eager for living, but no less sensitive to suffering, end of quote. So various aspects of her education. She goes to boarding school at the age of 16 and stays till 19. Around the age of 21, she stays for a short time with her great uncle and aunt, Max Weber Sr. and Helena Weber, at their Charlottenburg house in Berlin, where she meets Max, their son. The next year, 1892, she returns to Berlin to study art and live with them again, where she became very close to Helene, Max's mother, and eventually is engaged to Max. They marry then in 1893. So Mariana begins her university education around 1894 when the Webers moved to Freiburg, where Max was called to be professor of economics. There in 1895, Mariana Weber sat in on lectures by Heinrich Rickert and other philosophers. Later in 1900, she would write her first book, similar to a dissertation, on Fichte socialism and its relationship to Marxist doctrine. In 1896, the couple moves to Heidelberg, where Max becomes professor of political science. At that time, by the way, she studies with Adolf Hausrat, whose work she gets some of her material on Paul and the New Testament that she uses in the work that I'm focusing on. So over the next 7 years, Max struggles with several breakdowns and resigns from his position several times. And meanwhile, Mariana immerses herself in community involvement in the women's movement. In 1897, she starts a branch of an organization for the promotion of women's culture and education. In collaboration with others, in 1902, for example, she sets up a legal aid office for socially disprivileged mothers and girls. She gets involved in a campaign that's unsuccessful for voting rights for women in the Protestant church. She becomes active in the German Women's Federation and also a well-known speaker. In 1904, she speaks at the International Conference of the German Women's Federation in Berlin, along with other important speakers such as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was also invited. And Mariana Weber gave 2 talks there, several of which were actually critical of the socialist sort of orientation that she saw in Gilman's work, although she very much admired and had visited Gilman. 1904 was also the year that she and Max, along with others, including Ernst Troeltsch, traveled to the United States to attend a scholarly conference in conjunction with the World Fair in St. Louis. And in 1907, she spoke at the Protestant Social Congress at the invitation of Adolf Harnack on sexual ethics. So just some examples of her speaking engagements and her profile as a highly regarded speaker. So in 1910, the Webers moved to the house of the family of Max's mother in Heidelberg, where they held their Sunday teas. So much has been written, especially recently, with the publication and editing of more of Max's letters through the enormous project of those involved in his collected works, about Max's various affairs with women such as Mina Tobler and Elsa Jaffe von Richthofen. And as is well known, Mariana mentions nothing of this in her biography of Max, and was herself close friends with both women, especially Elsa, and dedicated some of the volumes of Max's posthumously published writings to them. The views of her and Max on questions of marriage and on the more radical movements centered around eroticism and free love are surely complicated by these facts, since they were both opposed to the new ethic of sexual liberation. Max in particular seemed to revise his judgment about it, and both maintained friendships with those involved in it. But it will continue to be the role of biographers, and not of me, to grapple with these tensions and contradictions in their personal and intellectual lives. So just briefly, before I want to get to her thought, which is the focus of my own study. So later in life, in 1919, after the war, she was elected to the State Assembly in Baden as a member of the German Democratic Party, although she only held that position for a short time. And at this time, she was also elected president of the League of German Women's Associations. And after Max's death in 1920, she does many things, one of which is she later then establishes her own intellectual circle, which includes large numbers of women as participants, but actually fewer women who actually gave presentations. Most of the presentations were by men, though not all. During the years of National Socialism, the group continued to meet, and it did exclude National Socialists and included some who eventually went into exile during the Nazi years. Though not overtly political, politics, according to some biographers and historians, were discussed quietly and behind closed doors in the group. And in portrayals by various scholars, and in her own remembrances, Mariana Weber was said to have considered herself to have failed morally during the Nazi era, as she survived, she says, through silence and didn't sacrifice her life while masses of innocent people were destroyed. And she refers to her own transcendental guilt and failure before her highest ideals and values. Following the war, she continued her meetings for a number of years, and then she died in 1954 after having outlived Max for 34 years. During her life, she was mostly known as a leading female intellectual, a prominent member of the moderate wing of the women's movement, and a popular speaker. She wrote 8 books and edited a number of Max's works that were published after his death, and she published countless essays of her own in women's journals and in pamphlets published by organizations such as the Protestant Social Congress. And indeed, many of the spouses of the men in the Iranos crisis, this circle that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, were actively involved in the women's movement and also represented a new type of educated woman. Mariana and her female colleagues were among the first generation of women to be educated in Germany. And while they were independent intellectuals and leaders in cultural organizations, they also defended the work and the liberalism of their husbands in the face of challenges from both conservative and radical groups. So I now want to turn to Mariana Weber on sexuality and secularization, which is part of the writing that I'm doing right now for my project. So the book that's most central to my project is Mariana Weber's major work, published in 1907, which is translated Wife and Mother in the Development of Legal Norms, and for which, by the way, she was given an honorary doctorate in law from the University of Heidelberg in 1924. In this massive work of historical sociology, Weber explores the gender ethic of civilizations and religions that she sees as contributing to the ethos of modern Germany, with an eye to the future of women's emancipation. Specifically, Weber describes and analyzes customs, laws, and norms concerning marriage, sexuality, prostitution, male authority, female submission, and autonomy, and the status of children in what she calls ancient cultures and religions, including so-called primitive religions, Egyptian and Babylonian cultures, and the early periods of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, as well as Hellenistic culture and Greek religions, and also in the traditions of medieval Europe and the Reformation and modern, mostly Anglo-American Protestantism. The book ends with an explicit treatment and critique of the new civil code, which Germany had adopted in 1900, and this code then recognized women as legal persons and granted them certain freedoms in relationship, especially to work, but essentially preserved the husband's authority over wife and children in almost all areas and made it much more difficult for women to initiate divorce. So the opening chapter of Weber's book can be understood in part by placing it in relationship to debates over the origins of the family and male authority and women's subordination that had arisen mid-century and continued to be topics of great intellectual controversy among scholars around 1900. In 1861, Johann Backhofen wrote a work on the development of the family through 4 stages, beginning with sexual promiscuity that led first to 2 stages of matriarchal culture and ended in a final stage of patriarchy guided by norms of reason, law, and order. This book, called The Mother Right, or Das Mutterrecht, though looking back to a primeval age of mother right and female authority, was not a progressive call for women's emancipation, but was instead a critique of certain features of modern European culture and a nostalgic and politically conservative call for a retrieval of values rooted in more organic and natural forms of community and authority. Bachofen's work influenced a number of anthropologists who did not necessarily embrace the specifics of his claims, but took up the project of looking to so-called primitive histories and structures of kinship, family, sexuality to understand the development of culture. By the 1880s and 90s, Bachofen's thesis about the matriarchal origins of the family was taken up by socialist and feminist intellectuals, most prominently by Friedrich Engels in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Engels used Bachofen's work, and more prominently that of Lewis Henry Morgan, to attack patriarchy, arguing that the early period of so-called mother right had also been marked by economic and social equality. It was the emergence of the idea of private property, according to Engels, that brought about women's subordination and patriarchal oppression. In theories like those of Engels and the numerous others that would follow, debates on the roles of matriarchy and patriarchy provided a way to question accepted gender roles in the current setting and for anticipating changes in the future. So these theories, in a sense, functioned as myths that organized different kinds of attitudes and perspectives in relationship to different kinds of feminist struggles. So both Max and Mariana Weber developed their theories of gender relations and the origins of the patriarchal family in opposition to Engels' work. In all their works on the origin, history, and nature of marriage, in all of her works on these topics, Mariana Weber offers a multifaceted understanding of the institution of marriage. By nature, it is both emancipatory and confining for women. So chapter 1 of Weber's work, of her 1907 book, is called Primitive Gender Relations and Legitimate Marriage. Here, Weber takes up a wide range of anthropological studies of the origins of male-female relations, including theories of group marriage, kinship structures, mother right, as mentioned, polygamy, totemism, and matriarchy. One of her goals in this chapter is to refute the general idea of an original state of gender relations that was free of male domination, or the flip side, that was predicated on women's authority or autonomy. As she distinguishes her view from socialist perspectives, Weber articulates her own theories of power, agency, structure, and sexuality. These theories can be detected in the distinctions she makes among types of religions and cultures. In some ways, Weber is careful not to place too much weight on claims made about so-called primitive groups. For, and now I'm quoting her, no historical record reaches back to an original time or an original condition, end of quote. Any similarities discovered in comparisons of various peoples, cultures, or tribes are always problematic, she says, for the history of each group is, quote, diverse and dynamic. Likewise, Weber cautions against a linear developmental history in which so-called primitive forms of collective life represent a passage through which all peoples travel on their way to so-called maturity. Historical development, in her view, is more complicated than that, even though patterns, impulses, and precursors to later trends are illuminating and interesting, in her view. Finally, Weber does state outright that she is measuring these groups' practices according to the present values in her own time and for the normative purpose of her own self-understanding. So notwithstanding many of the variations in kinship practices among the groups Weber treats in her chapter on primitive religions, as she calls them, these cultures share a model of sexuality and male-female relations that Weber might classify as unregulated. In other words, what we might call, though she doesn't, the so-called state of nature. The state of nature determines the male-female relation. The power and right of the stronger results in situations in which women are property and completely subject to the whims of men. The kinship patterns that do exist are often created due to necessity or, in her view, for expediency, and do not have the quality of rationalized or even spiritualized purpose that she attributes to the more official or legitimate institutions of later periods. Weber names the type of authority, and I suggest the type of sexuality found in these groups, primitive patriarchalism. So drawing on Weber's typology of various types of domination, the traditional authority, which includes patriarchalism, and then charismatic authority and legal rationalistic authority. So in her view, men had, quote, unlimited right of ownership over women and children, while the latter were left in relation to men completely without rights, permanently bound, and obligated to loyalty and obedience. In all these cultures and tribes, she says, quote, we can only speak of marriage in a figurative sense, end quote. These various forms of kinship are relations of force and reflect the unconditioned triumph of male domination. They lack, then, I guess, to use Max Weberian terminology, legitimacy. Marriage enters this process of historical development when, quote, the absolute power of the man finds its limits through certain obligations toward the woman. Only here does one move from primitive to legitimate patriarchalism, and thus to an ordered structure that one can call marriage. Though thoroughly patriarchal and still oppressive to women and children, the presence of communal norms and standards signals the creation of some kind of institution. And at some level, institutions, in her view, offer at least minimal protection to persons who are subject to them. The existence of the idea of a dowry is important here. Now the woman is given over to the power of the man, not unconditionally, but through a tool that, quote, elevates the woman as wife to a position above concubines, and that secures for her and her children the status of legitimate heirs. Weber summarizes the crucial features of this development in the following ways. Quote, in this way, the oldest conscious structuring of sexual relations were created everywhere out of the natural relation of power. The so-called legitimate marriage as an insurance of certain women and their children against the polygamous drives of the husband. Otherwise, initially, marriage completely maintained the character of a relationship of ownership. End quote. This original structure was then the basis for all subsequent developments, which tended, notwithstanding the particularities of their cultural and social forms, in the same general directions. On the one hand, civilizations tended over time to strive, quote, to somehow protect the woman from the barbaric arbitrariness of the husband, end quote, while simultaneously preserving the husband's domination over her and her children. This is now a humane patriarchy, which strives to temper the husband's domination but does not grant the wife any kind of recognition. And I would note that actually Ernst Troeltsch uses love patriarchalism to name this kind of marriage structure that he sees in the history of Christian social doctrine, in which there's a kind of kind and gentle authority of the patriarch over those in the family. And he does actually footnote this work by Mariana Weber as he develops what he calls the gender and sex ethic of different Christian groups. So it is with the development of so-called ancient versus primitive cultures that small steps are taken, in Mariana Weber's view, toward the recognition of women. And here I'm moving into a brief section on her views on monotheism and marriage. So let me speak briefly then about the significance that Weber gives to monotheism in the history of marriage. In her treatment of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, Weber tapped into Orientalist research that had been produced in the decades leading up to her study. She reads these traditions, as she does so-called primitive religions, in relation to norms about marriage and sexual regulation in the modern West. For Mariana Weber, the so-called great monotheistic religions, end quote, bring about a turning point in definitions of marriage. Judaism in particular, in her view, quote, surrounds marriage for the first time with a religious consecration of nothing less than world historical significance, end quote. While ancient Judaism permits polygamy, it lends deep theological significance to the covenant of marriage as an institution and an order blessed and mandated by God, who also calls for the subordination of wife to husband and therefore establishes a holy but patriarchal institution. Similarly, she says, in Islam, both the Quran and the Prophet contribute positively to the, quote, ethical regulation of the relations between the genders, end quote. Weber assesses these developments in various and sometimes conflicting ways. On the one hand, as I will discuss below, the consecration of marriage lays the groundwork for an ethical and spiritual form of the institution in which both partners are respected and called to an ethical relationship that is capable of recognizing and affirming the rights of women. On the other hand, the consecration of marriage by God amounts to, quote, a sanctioning of patriarchalism, end quote, that will exert its negative influence on women and that will leave the institution of marriage unchanged for millennia. This divinely commanded form of marriage will also, quote, determine the structure of Christian marriage up until our own time, end quote, notes Weber. In her analysis of Christian history, Weber points to Paul's success in sealing women's obligation of obedience and women's inferiority to the man. This doctrine of patriarchalism remains unchallenged throughout the development of the institution of the church, which also begins early in its history to become preoccupied with ascetic ideals that seek excessively to control sex and, quote, despise all that is natural, until the very relation between men and women is classified as part of, quote, the domain of sin. These ideas about women's sexuality and sin serve to strengthen norms for women's subordination. The magisterial reformers, in her view, do nothing to challenge these ideas, despite their affirmation of marriage over celibacy. Luther and Weber's account of the history of theological norms concerning marriage is a chief defender of patriarchalism and roots it in part in Eve's sin. Yet, alongside the patriarchalism of the Christian doctrine of marriage, there develops, in Weber's view, quote, a large new cultural historical product, end quote, that contains potentially seeds for women's emancipation within the institution. This initially happens in early Christianity when, quote, for the first time in history, there is an imposition of the demand of monogamy on the man as well as the woman. She also attributes this to Stoicism. This creates a new marriage ideal that generates a religious cultural imperative that is directed toward and calls upon the participation of both partners. Marriage becomes an institution that nurtures the spiritual strength of men and women and that creates fertile ground for a, quote, tender and deep spiritual relation between man and woman, end quote. For much of Christian history, beginning with many of Paul's ideas, this impulse does not develop in ways that tend toward women's emancipation, but instead carries on the mode of patriarchalism. The theological ideas that develop in Calvinism, however, do nurture moral and spiritual sensibilities that later tend in the direction of, quote, a moral equality of the sexes, and indirectly toward the higher position and valuing of women, end quote. The ethical consequences of belief in divine predestination lead to a stronger emphasis on moral discipline and self-control, in her view, which can promote a marriage setting in which women and men focus on a relationship that differs from that of standard patriarchalism. This ideal is developed most significantly in Puritan and other Protestant movements that lay outside the major institutional churches. Puritanism deepens the ideal in a counterintuitive way and by means of an unexpected path, in her view. Precisely through its strict asceticism toward pleasures and sensuality, it gives marriage a very clear purpose, that is, the procreation of children for the greater glory of God, and otherwise encourages spouses to develop their spiritual relationship above all. Here we see in Weber's view the cultivation of two free and moral personalities within the marriage bond, and therefore also the recognition of the moral personality of the woman. Weber sees the confirmation of this potentially emancipatory ideal in the fact that it is the Puritan and other similar Protestant movements in the U.S. that first take the religious equality of the woman seriously. This is also a very strong theme in Trelch's work on the history of Christian social doctrine, and in his book that was translated, Protestantism in Progress, as well. The Quakers above all emphasized the idea of freedom of conscience, quote, the mother of all civil rights of the individual, and, quote, the cradle of women's rights as well. Though time does not permit me to expand on these very brief indications of her interpretations of early modern Protestant groups, I will simply note that they provide an impulse toward the development of the marriage ideals Weber seems to approve in her own essays on marriage and morals in her own time. Modern marriage, in her view, should be, quote, a life's partnership that is founded on the affinity of souls and senses and on the desire for full responsibility as the highest ideal of human community that stands as an unshakable guiding star above the sexual life of civilized humanity, end quote. It shares with Puritanism the focus on spirituality above mere sex drive and the desire to shape the personality of both partners. But of course, this view of marriage demands a host of economic, legal, educational, and political rights for women that are appropriate, in Weber's view, for a modern industrialized capitalist society. So by looking at these features of Mariana Weber's work and placing it in relation to categories that were also being used in the formation of new theories about religion and society around 1900, I hope that I have begun to show that scholarly analyses of modernization and secularization in fin de siècle Germany were far from gender neutral. Today, scholars have produced important analyses of the so-called co-constitution of categories like religion, modernity, and the secular by drawing on tools related to the study of colonialism, Western cultural imperialism, and empire. But I would like to suggest that gendered concerns were also central to the development of intellectual categories that were formed at this time that was so central for the shaping of the modern disciplines of religion and social theory. Gender, therefore, might be one missing link in scholarly understandings of the origin and rhetorical function of theories about religion and modernity. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, we do have a little time for questions, and do you want to recognize people? Or do you want to,
Sure, that sounds good.
should we ask them to identify themselves? Or?
Sure. I don't know everybody.
Oh.
No, not at all.
Please identify yourself when you ask the question.
Hi. Yes.
I'm Steve Culver. I've written a little on it. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I'm just confused about one matter right at the end, I think, when you brought up really the important questions of conscience and responsibility. And I thought at that point you were connecting these two big picture themes to gender. Were you doing that? If you were, I would argue they were themes that were discussed cross-gender, and they were massive themes around Max Weber and his questioning regarding what is, or how can we live ethically in the modern world, really. That was a question that involved accountability, responsibility, conscience. So I don't see I don't see an appropriation of these concepts by women. I see them more as generally there, which maybe it's the case, I don't know. Women are taking them and running with them farther. But I don't think, I would debate you if you are arguing that they were pushed at their origin by women.
Oh, right. No, I'm not. I'm not arguing that. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, actually. I don't know that I have, well, I know I don't have the expertise to point to exactly the places in the various aspects of social theory that do link up with gender. But certainly I agree that I think Mariana Weber's work just makes very explicit that these categories were involved in questions about society and relationship, and appropriate forms of those relationships involving conscience of the individual and the role of different cultures and religious groups in relationship to larger ethical questions that often had gender dimensions. But I think that we don't have, for example, I guess the we as people interested in theory and method in the study of religion, or in Christian theology in certain parts of Europe in the modern period. There's not really a study that looks explicitly at the gender dimensions of these terms. More in sociology, there are some, especially articles. But that this is something that has, a story that hasn't been told when we think about theories of secularization and modernity. And when even as we're problematizing theories of secularization and modernity and the origin of these theories, we often don't think that gender has to do with the origin of these theories. One sees, for example, the significance of gender in sort of studies of globalization and religion today, or issues of gender and globalization and the category of the secular today, often applied to religions and cultures outside of certain parts of the Christian Europe setting that these writers were sort of writing from. So I'm thinking of inserting this back into that and using her work as a way of pointing to these themes. So I don't know if that. So I completely agree, and thank you for that comment. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Carolyn Poinelli, and my question has to do with what she was doing specifically during the war, and if her relationship to the patriarch, what held her back from actually participating in opposition to National Socialism as it was happening. Do you have any idea, or did her work at that point stop, or were there any changes, or how was she participating from, say, the mid-30s until her death?
I can say a little bit about that. I'm focusing my study more on the earlier period, and I can't claim to be completely well read on all the literature about that. But she did not publish much at that time. One of her books called Women in Love actually did come out, but it was written before 1933. And that offered like a typology of different types of female relationships and the ways in which they're nurturing, like mothering and friendship and different kinds. That was a popular work. But I think what she was doing was, as far as I know, sort of kind of quietly continuing her group, continuing her local work. She was involved. She had various friends who made different choices about their opposition. Adolf Harnack's daughter, I think, was involved in her circle, and at least at the beginning of the period, spoke out against anti-Semitism, and she didn't. So there's more coming out about that, I think. But her writing her publishing of stuff at that period seems to have stopped a bit, or carried on later through her memoir, and et cetera. But these books that I'm focusing on are from about 1920 to 1919.
What I was wondering was if any of her theories actually contributed to her silence, like of the patriarchy, of why. Maybe that's not a fair question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
She was scared silly. She didn't have a chance. She was if she had opened her mouth, she would have gone off to a concentration camp immediately. Just no question of it. She knew that. Max Weber wrote a very long, 100 pages or more, psychoanalytic interpretation of his illness. He was debilitated for 6 years. She was afraid the Nazis would get hold of it and use it against her and him. She burned it. At any rate, in the climate at the time, she just couldn't speak out. A lot of intellectuals at the German universities were so thoroughly intimidated.
Hi, I'm Chip Lockwood. I'm a PhD student here in religion. And so I was really struck by what you were saying about how often male writers at this sort of turn of the century, in the same circle that Mariana was part of, often had some kind of deep ambivalence or pessimism about the shape of modernity. Whereas you said that you thought female writers often had a more optimistic sense of possibility. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that in relation to the category of secularization in particular, insofar as that, even Max Weber, I should say, categories of disenchantment and Sauerbrunn and so forth are often seen as kind of containing deep ambivalence on his part about the shape of modernity and the sense that there are new opportunities or a kind of new recognition of realities, but at the same time something being lost. I mean, the iron cage language, thoughts about the loss of a kind of social cohesion and normative order. So I was just wondering if, since that secularization category seemed a real locus for that ambivalence on the part of the writers that many of us know better, often the male writers, if you might say a little bit more about Mariana's perspective and in relationship to the optimism, if it was a reading of the same category differently, or if there was just a different diagnosis of secularization itself.
I would say a couple things. That actually is not my argument. I was reporting on an article by Ann Taylor Allen who makes that argument and shows the various ways in which, for example, theories of historical relativism and social change, in her view, as reflected in the groups, in certain both intellectual and activist activities among certain women, often propelled them into a sense of the new possibilities for reshaping relationships and norms and ideals. And that she said that in the secondary literature, it's become a kind of cliche to characterize everyone as being pessimistic. I mean, the male scholars as being pessimistic. I would also say, though, that I myself have had some trouble with, and I think that's part of what I'm doing in this project in a roundabout way. I've had some trouble with the ways in which scholars of religion kind of tell the story of the origin of the idea of secularization. And the way that the term, as it's been problematized maybe in the last many decades in the 20th century, is projected back onto this setting in ways that I think overlook more of the textured and just different political concerns that intellectuals had that don't line up clearly with an ideology of secularization or secularism. So, for example, different kinds of vocabulary words are often translated secular in the material we see, like Verweltlichung, like, the worldly, right? Worldliness is just translated secular, right? Or this worldliness, die Sichtigkeit or something, it's just translated secular. So there's an assumption, I think, that what we have, how scholars of religion have come to tell the story of where secularization theory comes from and where it went and what values it had and what alleged political projects it involved, right? That story, I think, is predicated on the application of a later term to an earlier period that I think misses an opportunity for an analysis of the relationship between politics and theology kind of in its own setting. So I would say that, for example, in the case of someone like Ernst Troeltsch, whose my work has been on, that I don't think that there's this pessimism. I think there's actually a sense of that religion, for example, changes in different contexts, and what it might do in a changing context is open to question and has possibilities. It won't look the way it did, but that doesn't mean that there's an assumption of, for example, decline or privatization that's being bemoaned or something. It's just an awareness that religion is a kind of dynamic variable in a setting that involves political, economic, social spheres that changes. So I guess I would, that's my way of answering your question in sort of a roundabout way. So, thanks. Yeah.
Amelia Cohen. First question is biographical, and the second question is about her theoretical contribution. Very quickly. So, biographically, there was an allusion made to the 6 years that Max Weber experienced mental instability and withdrew from the world, etc. And I think that happened rather early in her marriage, in their marriage. And I wondered to what extent did that free her to become the person she was, or establish a certain kind of relationship of equality between them that might have been lost otherwise? I mean, she was, I guess she was somewhat younger than he was. I don't know, a decade or so.
I guess.
I didn't ask my second question.
Okay.
Oh, I can ask. So my second question, I'm really interested in this. You said that her theory of the family and marriage was developed in conscious opposition to Engels' origin. You did say
Oh,
that.
I see. Yes, yeah.
And I wondered, I wasn't clear where you situated, exactly where you situated that opposition. Was it the issue of patriarchy, matriarchy?
Okay, gotcha.
No, sir. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I guess the biographical sources that I've read sometimes do suggest that during Max's bouts with mental illness and various trips to the country or to various institutions, that she focused herself on her public activities in the women's movement. And the book that I'm working on, that's published in 1907, she did start around 1900, so that was a very robust kind of endeavor and involving all sorts of culling together of secondary literature. So I suppose it's possible that that's true, and I've certainly seen allusions to that in people who have written little, either large or small, kind of biographical accounts of that period. Though certainly she would have also been, suffered and burdened by this development as well, and she herself also struggled with depression toward the end of her life, but that's also been kind of variously interpreted in this recent biography. So on Engels, I guess there's several things. One is the idea that an original state would be one free of patriarchy. And also in this chapter, one of the things I didn't have time to mention is that she's very, she often calls this a kind of vulgar socialistic account of history. And so I think she's uncomfortable with the model of historical development as being too kind of monocausal. And then the idea that patriarchy first emerges, or male domination first emerges with private property and gets worse with capitalism. And she's sort of saying almost the opposite in some ways. That so it's all sorts of things that she's taking issue with. So, yeah.
This is partly building on that question. I'm really excited by your suggestion at the end that this study will challenge or complicate the recent scholarship on the origins of religious studies. And one of the concerns I've had about that scholarship is that it tends to portray the founders of religious studies as monolithic, rather than dealing fully with their internal debate. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about her debates with socialist feminists, with Gilman as well as with Engels, and how those debates contributed to the emergence of religious studies as a discipline?
Whoa, that's a hard question. Okay, good question. I think she, in terms of some of her disputes with more socialist feminists, she really was committed to marriage as a vocation for women in many ways. And she did not believe it was realistic for women to, for most women, not for all women, but for most women, to be sort of freed from marriage. She didn't think that most women would really earn enough to support themselves in terms of in working in factories or whatever. That she just for all sorts of reasons, also her moral ideal, she idealizes the very idea of marriage. And so the idea that women are emancipated apart from the institution of marriage is something that she is uncomfortable with, though not vehemently opposed to, but just thinks it's not realistic and misses something rich, I think she thinks, about what she sees as this kind of moral, personal union and respect in marriage or something like that, she... So I guess maybe that suggests, I'm really thinking out loud here, that she does really have, she does place great value or have a model of, great value on an institution and structure as a site for agency and empowerment. And that I think is interesting. That again complicates this kind of monolith of kind of liberal Protestantism, right? Because she would be part of this cultural Protestant or liberal Protestant lump that allegedly all kind of shares the same set of values or whatever. But I think she really sees agency empowerment as happening within structures, and therefore I don't think she's actually a kind of prolific theorist of religion. I'm not actually saying that. I mean, she writes a lot of interesting books that give us interesting insights into how religion and categories about social theory were being used and employed. But I think she does, if one were to cull a theory of religion, I think that she would say that it involves different kinds of emancipatory possibilities, some of which happen within traditional structures of legitimate domination, and some of which happen when one is outside of those in different kinds of smaller relationships, like what she kind of idealizes the Puritans, or she kind of takes up, for example, the very, very short section in her book about the community around Jesus and how it's a very, in that sense, it is a very typical notion that, all the people were together and respected each other's personality, and it was just kind of a brotherhood and sisterhood, under God sort of thing, right? So religion can promote both impulses, more emancipatory, individualistic, personality-oriented, but also more institutional and structural-oriented. So maybe that, I guess, complexifies what the category of religion, what many things it meant. And again, not just this kind of notion of, with greater modernization and individualism, you get sort of more individualistic religion or less religion. That I don't think her views really support that theory, if that makes sense.